So I guess it's that time of year again. It is time for the annual Bible group kerfuffle. This one compliments of a Facebook user who wrote, "Wow, Thomas Nelson Bibles, really? Is your creative department totally out of ideas? Yes, I know it's been around for a long time, but to deny that it has been firmly established by Schuyler Bibles as brand identity borders on dishonesty. Why not use anything but that?" And that they are referring to is the Jerusalem cross, which if you look at this picture, it does look in some ways like what Schuyler uses. However, one thing that I noticed in fairness to Nelson Bibles is that another post showed a couple of Bibles with crosses on them, and this person said, "Love the new crosses series Thomas Nelson is doing in the NKJV." And the top one has the Jerusalem cross, which is now highly associated with Schuyler Bibles, but the bottom one has a different cross. So in fairness to Nelson Bibles, it looks like they actually are using various cross designs, but I guess there is a question here that has been brought up. Is this a problem what Thomas Nelson has done in this instance using the Jerusalem cross when the Jerusalem cross is being used for brand recognition by Schuyler Bibles? What I want to do in this video really is make two major points. The first one is to talk about why this does potentially matter. There's some people who would say it doesn't really matter and Nelson hasn't done anything wrong, so just set it aside totally. But I would say there maybe is something to think about here. There is something that potentially matters. But then I want to talk about why this ultimately doesn't matter and really make the case that, at least at this point in this instance, it's not really something that people should be making that big of a deal about. I don't think it needs to turn into a full-blown kerfuffle. So first I want to look at why does this even matter? One of the arguments that some people have made is that the Jerusalem cross is not trademarked by Schuyler. So this doesn't really matter in their way of thinking because Nelson is allowed to use the Jerusalem cross. It's not like it's trademark infringement. However, it made me think of a situation that I think in some ways could apply to this situation. Many of you remember the older iMac computers, the ones with the colored look to them. But do you remember the E1 computer from that time period? The E-Machines E1 is what I'm referring to, and you can see a picture here, what it looked like. This is from Wikipedia. It said the E1 is an all-in-one desktop computer that was produced by E-Machines in 1999. The external design of the E1 was very similar to that of Apple Computer's Bondi Blue iMac. As a result, E-Machines was sued by Apple for allegedly infringing upon the distinctive trade dress of the iMac. Apple and E-Machines settled the case in 2000, requiring the model to be discontinued. So what is trade dress that they're referring to? If you look at that link, it says trade dress is the characteristics of the visual appearance of a product or its packaging, or even the design of a building that signify the source of the product to consumers. Trade dress is an aspect of trademark law, which is a form of intellectual property protection law. But going back to the E-Machines E1 article, it says upon its release in 1999, the E1 came with a translucent cool blue case, while the original iMac had a two-tone case with Bondi blue accents. At US $799, the E1 was also cheaper than the $1199 iMac. E-Machines hoped to avoid legal trouble because the shape of the computer was different from the iMac. However, Apple sued E-Machines, alleging that the computer's design infringed upon the protected trade dress of the iMac. In March 2000, E-Machines reached a settlement with Apple under which it agreed to discontinue the infringing model. So what this story brings out is that there can be legal issues even if you're not talking about a specific trademarked symbol or word, something like that. Even the look of an item can have a trademarked aspect to it, or a trade dress, as it's called there. And I think that's what might apply more in this situation. It's the question of whether Nelson is producing any Bibles that in some way infringe upon the trade dress, the protected look of a Schuyler Bible. Now, again, in fairness to Nelson, they didn't just use the Jerusalem cross. There was at least one other cross that they used in this series. Also, you'll notice if you look at that picture, underneath the Jerusalem cross, they have Holy Bible, and that is something different than what you would typically see on a Schuyler Bible today. So I think Nelson has distinguished themselves enough for it not really to be a legal issue. That being said, the reason this is a potential issue is because there is this thing called trade dress, and it is protected under law. When you design a product and people associate that look with your brand, other companies have to be very careful that they're not copying that in such a way that people begin to be confused or associate your product with the other brand. So, Thomas Nelson, if you look at their Bible here, people are going to have different opinions as to how much this particular one looks like a Schuyler Bible. Also, Nelson produced another Bible in the Sovereign Collection series, the Sovereign Collection Bible, that was a KJV, and that one had some features that were very similar and reminiscent of the Schuyler Canterbury. And so I think the reason people were reacting to Nelson is because of what happened before, and it's like this seems like a recurring thing where they are taking cues from Schuyler and mimicking a lot of what they are doing over at Schuyler. So that's why it's potentially important. At this point, I really don't think that there's a strong legal case from what I can tell. I'm not a legal expert, but I think Nelson has differentiated themselves where it's not necessarily a problem. But you can see how it could potentially be a problem. And that's why I think this is an important issue. It's not just about the Jerusalem cross. It's about trade dress and product design. But I want to end this video talking about why this really isn't that important when it comes down to it in this situation. And it has to do with, I think, how the public ultimately judges a situation like this. I think people are going to have different opinions as to how Nelson looks in a situation like this, or how Schuyler looks in a situation like this, but depending on how they react. But really what I think people are judging by is what Nelson is doing in some way going to infringe on the business of Schuyler. I think that's what really people in the general public would judge a case like this by, and how they would feel about it. And if Nelson was really taking away from the sales of Schuyler, I think people could see why that would be a problem. But I think it's really questionable as to whether that is the case. One thing we have to remember is that Thomas Nelson is producing Bibles like this in the New King James Version. That Sovereign Collection series Bible was in the King James Version. So Schuyler Bibles, on the other hand, is producing their various Bibles in all different translations. So that's one thing to consider here. But also, just from an anecdotal outside point of view, looking at Schuyler myself, it seems to me that they're a relatively small operation, and that they are continually selling out of their product. They have a very niche market, I would say, and that market, that group of people that buys from Schuyler, they've tapped into that, and people are buying continually from Schuyler. I do think their market is growing, but ultimately it seems to me that the demand for Schuyler Bibles is kind of outweighing the supply overall when all is said and done. Now, I know they may have inside information and look at this a little bit differently, but it seems to me, looking at the outside, that Schuyler Bibles is selling out regularly. It seems like even with the New King James Version, they will produce the NKJV, Quentel, Schuyler Bible, and eventually their stock will run out and they will print another run. So is Thomas Nelson really affecting the business of Schuyler? Maybe to some degree, but I don't think enough to where it really is that important of an issue. So that's how I would look at this whole situation. I just thought it was interesting and wanted to share some of my thoughts on it, give some of these points from what I've thought about and researched. I would love, though, to hear what you think in the comment section. It's interesting to hear different perspectives on this. And I think, we have to be careful. I know a lot of us, and in the comment section, I don't want you to get too argumentative. We can feel really strongly about how businesses operate, and we can get really frustrated. And I think that's kind of what the situation is tapping into to some degree. But at the end of the day, like I said, it doesn't seem like at this point it's really all that important. I just think Nelson does need to be careful. They need to consider the trade dress issue going into the future. And Schuyler just needs to consider, is this really something worth fighting about? Probably not. If anything, it would kind of make them look bad if they did make a big deal out of it at this point. So let me know what you think in the comments section, but thank you so much for taking some time to listen to some of my thoughts on this, brought to you from A Frisch Perspective.